So I've been thinking about some really basic questions regarding education. I've asked the question, what are we educating for? Really, what is the outcome that we want? What are the outcomes that we want? Why do we do it? And how is the best way? And most importantly, for whom is this all supposed to benefit? And I've been giving talks at UDEC and IDEC conferences. I think this is my third time now. And I've shared a couple ideas. One is about invisible learning, which I wrote in a book called Aprendizaje Invisible. Wrote in Spanish with a colleague from Chile. Also talked a bit about nomad society. And also we worked on Manifesto 15. In this talk, I want to go back and revisit some ideas in invisible learning because it's been 5 years since we published a book. And the world has changed a bit. And I want to give a little apology about some of the things we got wrong, but I also want to share a theory for invisible learning, which we did not have before. So invisible learning analyzes the impact of technological advancements and changes in formal, non-formal, and informal education, and the fuzzy metaspaces in between. And the product that we had was really a journey that offered an overview of options for the future development of education that is really relevant for this century. So invisible learning recognizes that most of what we learn is invisible. That is just between non-formal and serendipitous learning. Let's see, we go non-formal, informal, and serendipitous learning. Sometimes formal education can be a little bit invisible as well, right? Serendipitous learning, for example, it just happens. And so we really suggested a new ecology for education that was really collecting ideas and combinations and reflections of learning as a continuum of learning that really extends throughout life. It can happen anytime or anywhere. And also, this perspective is really designed to help us think about the gap that we have between formal education and the rest of what we learn. So think about a time you learned something just because you were curious. How did you do it? Chances are it didn't happen because somebody told you to learn it, not through formal instruction. And likewise, with invisible learning, it's hard for us to tell exactly how much we learn as human beings, what is learned invisibly versus through formal education. But John Seeley Brown guesstimates that the ratio is about 5-to-1. So that means that for every 6 things that we learn, 5 of them are not in formal education. Right? And we talk about skills and competencies that we need for future jobs. Chances are most of them are not being taught in schools. And this is what we had to say about invisible learning until just recently. We say invisible learning takes into account the impact of technological advances and changes in formal, non-formal, and informal education, in addition to the fuzzy metaspaces in between. Right? And for this, I apologize. We seem to have gotten a bit hung up on technology in this. It's not about computers, it's not about iPads, it's not about holes in the wall. It's about connecting with ourselves as humans, embracing the human experience, and most importantly, trusting each other to learn. Thank you. Guys, it's all about trust, and I'm here to fix that today, or help fix that today. I get back to trust. As our colleagues from Puerto Rico reminded us, learning cannot be dictated to us. It is only at the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Learning is directed from the heart as we seek our own passions. So a lot has changed since we wrote the book in 2011. And we really need a formal theory for invisible learning now more than ever. So again, technology is not the point, but rather placing trust in kids and getting away from power games and games of control in schools. All right? The first pressure is that society needs nomadic workers that can work with context, not with rigid structure. Right? And one key reality is that jobs schools typically prepare us for, as Agata, quite nicely showed us, is for clerical work, or work as factory workers, bureaucrats, or soldiers. And these jobs are disappearing. They're being replaced with knowledge and innovation-based work, which really requires people to function contextually and work almost anytime, anywhere, and with just about anybody. And so these emerging workers are what I call nomads. I like to spell it KNOWMADS, because it's really knowledge workers that can work anytime, anywhere, with just about anybody, but they work nomadically, applying their knowledge across different gigs or contingent engagements to create new value. Now, this is really important because we project by the year 2020, 45% of the workforce in the West will be nomadic or freelance or contingent workers. And that's a huge shift, 45% in 4 years. In 1989, nomads could have only comprised 6% of the workforce in the United States. And so this is a huge shift. The second thing is that many beliefs and practices in mainstream education are simply very old. They have no grounding in reality. We'd be very hard-pressed to find an academic study that argues that kids learn best from 7:45 in the morning until 2:37 p.m., right? Yet we model our schools around absurd hours and times that better mirror, factory work, factory life, that we don't even have factories anymore. We further segregate kids into grades, assuming that kids learn best when they're separated from each other. That's bullshit. It's simply not true. And we all too often assume that our motivations to learn is extrinsic. That is, we have grown to believe the myth that kids will not learn anything unless they're told what to learn. And that cannot be any further from reality. Even more troubling, the most meaningful ways that kids learn, right, through play, curiosity, exploration, are discounted in formal learning. We think that play is not learning in mainstream education somehow, unless if it's directed as a top-down structured activity. How can we dare say that we're enabling kids' curiosity if we're telling them what to be curious about? These are your options for curiosity. That's awful. How can we justify labeling activities as exploration if we already know the destination? And why are we so afraid to let children play freely? Third point is that we simply cannot measure a person's knowledge, right? I think we talked about this quite a bit. Tests only measure how well a student completes a test. And right now, Finland is home to the best test takers in the world. It's kind of like being the best-looking kid in an ugly family, isn't it? So soft skills and non-cognitive skills can be really difficult to measure. But we've become really obsessed with measurement in schools. It's so much that we've really convinced ourselves that we can even measure what a person knows. And that's simply not true. We cannot measure what's inside a person's head. At the same time, yes, we do need to demonstrate accountability in our schools. We should not value what we measure, but rather we need to measure what we value. And we need to find a way beyond high-stakes testing that do very little to reveal what students actually know. It's time for us to determine what we value as individuals, as our communities, as families, and look at that. So again, 5 years ago, we structured invisible learning as a meta-theory that really recognized that most of what we learn is invisible through informal, non-formal, serendipitous experiences. We learn alone, in a group, through individual and shared experiences, through experimentation, exploration, and through the consequences of enabling serendipity. Invisible learning is not a theory for learning itself. Rather, it is an endpoint or an actual state of learning that emerges when we remove structures that control or direct our experiences. So, here's our theory for invisible learning. It is simply that we learn more and do so invisibly when we separate structures of control that restrict freedom and self-determination from learning experiences. Right? It's about placing a little more trust. Removing control opens possibilities, right? The end goals or outcomes are neither dictated nor determined from the start. but they emerge as the learning develops. And such experiences include free play, self-organized learning communities, authentic problem solving around areas of interest to ourselves, and experimentation to acquire new knowledge. A theory for invisible learning is focused on the development of personal knowledge. That is a blend of tacit and explicit elements that embrace a portfolio of skills that include cooperation, empathy, and critical thinking, as much as facts. And so the implication for this is that there is no master template for enabling invisible learning, but rather we need to attend to the formation of an ecology of options to help each of us find our own way. Invisible learning is about placing trust in learners and shifting the flow of power from the top down to the learner out. I don't like to say that we need a bottom-up revolution, because that assumes that there's still a top. In the visible learning world, it goes from the student out, from the learner out, because we're horizontalizing as this. The purpose of controlling the educational experience is to make learning visible. It's built on the implicit distrust of the learner and the false assumption that students will not learn unless they're told what to learn. In this sense, invisible learning is the end product of a theory which predicts that learning may blossom when we eliminate authoritarian control or direction of learning experiences by the others, like a teacher or government policy. So invisible learning can emerge in many ways, and often it manifests itself through bits and pieces here and there. And so I'll share some approaches that help us get to invisible learning. They're not exhaustive, and they're really just meant to be, little illustrations. And we've talked about much of this here. In a sense, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. But I think that this is also an affirmation of a lot of the work that we do here. So Derry mentioned some great examples of schools and schools within schools. And, democratic education schools, I think, are arguably the most visible examples of enabling self-determination. I think we do some great work. Among my favorite are the Sudbury-type schools that embrace these principles at the core, providing each student an equal voice and a vote alongside staff members and other stakeholders as to what they learn and how their schools are run. Students spend their time together without age separation or grade separation, and they decide how to spend their time together at the school. And these schools are part of a broader category of free schools, which really developed over the past century with many different approaches of how we interpret free. And we've had some great conversations this past week around that. Some operate as full democracies, some as social democracies, and even some as anarchist collectives. But unfortunately, there is very little research on democratic and free schools compared to mainstream education. But my hunch is that they serve the wealthy, or at least middle class or better educated families, where students have greater flexibility to pursue their own interests and have their own freedoms. And so for students in economically disadvantaged families and communities, this is, I think, where we need to focus on making the biggest impact. We need to connect democratic education with liberation pedagogies, such as critical pedagogy, eco-schools, and praxis-type schools. Right? Because while their foci are often connected with particular ideologies, though, they share common themes of socioeconomic liberation for the students and the communities that they serve. Finally, youth organizations and community participation opportunities that exist often help kids break outside of schools and try things and find their own pathways. We see this through scouting, through clubs, extension programs where students are not evaluated on a rigorous program, but instead earn badges. They develop creative products and create community-relevant outcomes that are based on their own interests. Free play is super important, and exploration. I wish Peter Gray was here to share his ideas on free play, because it is one of the most natural human activities where invisible learning occurs. Through play, children discover their own interests. They find out what they're good at. They inspire our curiosity, test boundaries. We learn social rules, and it helps us develop many soft skills. Unfortunately, mainstream approaches to education ignore or underplay the importance of free play in learning. And we separate play from sports or other organized activities, in that free play is explorative and it satisfies an individual's curiosity, whereas others tend to be, let's follow the rules and do what's been dictated for us. Similar to free play is free exploration. What happens, for example, when a child explores a culture beyond her own? What do you learn? What do you discover? What skills do you develop? And I think that many of the answers to these questions tend to be really tough, right? Because we're talking about developing intercultural competence, capabilities to handle ambiguity, empathy. And these are really hard things for us to teach in formal education. Finally, to break free of the structures of control, we need to build cultures of trust. We need to trust children to learn without being told what to learn. Democracies are built on trust and shared responsibility. Free play and exploration are built on trusting each other, trusting each of us to learn from each other. And teachers and school leaders have many opportunities to develop pathways towards invisible learning through participation, through play, and through exploration. And this can be exercised through our own praxis or our own practice, as long as our collaborative work with students. But the bottom line is that enabling invisible learning is centered on trust, and trusting children always learn, no matter what. And as we wrote in Manifesto 15, we said failing is a natural part of learning, where we can always try again. In a flat learning environment, the teacher's role is to help make sure that each learner makes a well-balanced decision. Because failing is okay, but the creation of failures is not. Right? We have to have trust that we are learning. And of course, if you have not signed Manifesto 15 yet, it's available at manifesto15.org, and chances are it is in your own language too. So that, folks, is a theory for invisible learning. Again, as we learn more and do so invisibly, when we separate structures of control that restrict freedom and self-determination from learning experiences. Thank you.